and welcome. I am here telling stories today about Trojan War Heroines. Last week, when my show was a little more kid focused, I told some princess power stories, and I decided I wanted to continue that energy this week and talk about a couple of queens. And these two stories, as well as a couple of stories that I've told at some of my past Thursday storytelling shows, have come from a longer show that I put together called Heroines. It was all Greek heroines for that particular show. I actually performed it last year at the Classic City Fringe Festival in Athens. And so I pulled together two of the stories from that show today, both queens who were part of the Trojan War stories in one way or another. My first story is going to be about Penelope, and you might know of her from the Greek epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, as Odysseus' wife. And I wanted to put together a story that focuses a little more on Penelope's perspective, and I also wanted to craft the story to give Penelope more agency over her situation. A woman who can spin and weave is a woman who can make things happen. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy, was known to work a loom so well that she defied any mortal woman to claim she could do it better. The fates spin out a thread for each human life, and at the end of the life, they cut the thread. If you want to know who's pulling the strings, look for a woman who weaves. Penelope was a woman like that. When she and Odysseus got married, she spun out two long threads to represent the threads of their lives. She twisted the threads together because their fates were intertwined. She tied them into a loop around her neck, and she always wore it to hold Odysseus close, no matter where he might travel. They were of one mind and one heart. Penelope and Odysseus were king and queen of Ithaca, and they hadn't been married all that long when Odysseus was called away to fight in the Trojan War and bring back the Spartan queen Helen. Penelope was especially sorry to see him go because they had an infant son, Telemachus. But she knew that no matter where Odysseus went, she would be able to hold him close. Penelope sat down at her loom. And if she wove and allowed her thoughts to wander to Odysseus, then when she looked at what she had woven, she would see him. She would see where he was, what he was doing. She could rearrange some of the threads to actually change what was happening and help him. And in this way, Penelope wove a tapestry of all the great battles of the Trojan War. She pulled some strings here and there to help the Greeks along. And at the same moment that wooden horse was rolling through the gates of Troy, Penelope was putting the finishing touches on a tapestry that depicted a great wooden horse, pregnant with deadly Greeks. Now, whether Odysseus put this image into her head or she put it into his, who could say? They were of one mind. And then the war was over, and Penelope eagerly awaited her husband's return. He'd been gone for 10 long years. But as she continued to weave, she saw how Odysseus' ship landed on the island of the Cyclops Polyphemus. She helped Odysseus and his crew escape. But she could not stop him from taunting Polyphemus as he sailed away. and telling the Cyclops his name. She saw how Poseidon, god of the sea, father of the Cyclopes, cursed Odysseus. No matter how hard he tried or how far he sailed, he would not be able to return to the shores of Ithaca for the next 10 years. And so Penelope settled in to wait and watch and weave to help as she was able. Other heroes began returning from the Trojan War, and Odysseus did not. Some of the men of Greece noticed. They wondered if perhaps Odysseus was not coming home, and if perhaps the lovely Queen Penelope was available to marry. They began showing up at her home, 10, 20, 40 suitors. And at first, Penelope didn't take them very seriously. She had bigger things to worry about. Finally, she realized she would have to tell them something. She did not tell them that she knew for a fact that Odysseus was alive. Because to do that, she would have to tell them how she knew he was alive. And if they knew the power she wielded with her loom, they would take it away from her. So Penelope appeared on the balcony that looked out over her great hall where all of the suitors were assembled, and she addressed them. Gentlemen, if I should remarry, I would move in to the home of my new husband, but that would leave my son Telemachus here alone to be raised by the servants. No, the son of the king and queen of Ithaca should be raised by his mother. I will not remarry as long as Telemachus is still a boy. The suitors didn't love the delay, but they agreed to it. They didn't leave, though. They stayed in Penelope's great hall, eating her meat and drinking her wine. Time passed. Penelope wove. She helped Odysseus and his crew escape from the island of the Lotus Eaters and get away from the sorceress Circe. And as the years passed, Telemachus grew. He grew into a young man, a teenager, by our standards, still a youth, but by ancient standards, an adult. And the suitors grew in number. 80, 100, 120 men now stayed in Penelope's great hall. They also grew impatient. They shouted out to her as she passed by in the halls. Telemachus is grown! Penelope will choose a husband! And this time as she looked out at the great hall, full of these suitors, she realized she had made a mistake by not taking them seriously. These men were not going to give up and go away. They were going to cause her a real problem. She was forced to make a terrible choice. Penelope stepped out onto the balcony over the great hall once again, and again she addressed the suitors. Gentlemen, when I remarry, I will move into my husband's new home. But my father-in-law is aged, and if I am not here, who will weave his funeral shroud? I will weave it now in preparation for that time, and when I have finished weaving the shroud, then I will choose a new husband. Once again, the suitors grudgingly agreed to this delay. How long could it take to weave a funeral shroud? Penelope set to work right away. She sat down at her loom. She wove all through that day. She completed a few inches of blue sky. At the end of the day, the suitors sent a maid to check on Penelope's progress. She saw Penelope had completed a few inches, weaving could be slow work. That seemed like enough for one day. And she went back to report to the suitors. But as soon as the maid was gone, Penelope began picking out the threads, unweaving the shroud. And as she did so, she also unwove not the actual passage of time, but the perception of the passage of time for all those living within her home. So that the next day, the suitors believed it was the first day of her weaving. And when the maid came to check on her progress in the evening and saw just a few inches, she thought that was good. That was enough for one day of weaving. This was the terrible choice that Penelope had made. Because in this way, she could delay the suitors for a long time, maybe indefinitely. But as long as she couldn't finish what she was weaving, she couldn't see the man beneath that blue sky. She didn't know where Odysseus was, what he was doing. She couldn't help him. And again, years passed. Those living in Penelope's home did not notice them passing, but they did. Now, parents sometimes imagine that their children have grown up overnight. Telemachus looked in the mirror and he thought he really had. He seemed suddenly to be bigger and stronger and more the sort of man who could help his mother stand up to the suitors. But a woman does not like to look in the mirror and suddenly see new wrinkles, new gray hairs, new inches around the waist. A woman does not like to imagine that she has grown old overnight, which is why it was a woman who discovered what Penelope was up to. One evening, it was an evening after years of weaving, but for the suitors, the same evening. One evening, after the maid came to check on Penelope's progress, she stood just outside the doorway and she watched as Penelope began unweaving the shroud. The maid crept away and returned with her favorite of the suitors to show him what Penelope was doing. And the suitor raised the alarm. A guard was set on Penelope day and night so that she would weave without undoing her work. Now the suitors, they just thought that Penelope was unweaving the shroud so that the weaving would take longer. They didn't realize the full extent of her trick. And if they were surprised to learn how much time had passed, well, time flies when you're having fun, living in someone else's house and eating their food. But now, as Penelope sat there at her loom, a smile spread across her face. She had delayed the suitors almost long enough. The 10 years of Odysseus' exile had come to an end. He would be able to come home. And now that she could complete the shroud, she could see the man beneath that blue sky. She could see where he was and what he was doing, and she would be able to help him. She wove, and she saw that Odysseus was stranded on the island of the immortal woman Calypso. He had no ship, no crew, no way to leave. She didn't know how long he had been there, perhaps the entire time that she had been weaving. Now, many men would be happy to be stranded on that island with that woman. But she could see from the look on Odysseus' face that he thought only of returning home to Ithaca. And so as she completed the shroud, she added into the bottom of the picture a raft and a statue of Athena, the patron goddess of all those like Odysseus and Penelope who are clever. Now the raft would not bring him all the way to Ithaca, but with the goddess's blessing, it would take him to a neighboring island where he could acquire a ship and a crew. As soon as Penelope finished the shroud, the suitors took up their cry again. Penelope will choose a husband! She needed just a little more time. She appeared on the balcony before the suitors. Gentlemen, when I remarry, our marriage must be blessed by the gods. But the gods will not smile upon us if there is any chance that Odysseus still lives. I have sent my son Telemachus to Sparta to speak with Menelaus. Odysseus fought for Menelaus in the war to bring back his wife Helen, and Menelaus has been in contact with many from that time. If there is anyone who knows anything about Odysseus, anyone who might have gotten word about what has happened to him, it is Menelaus. When Telemachus returns and he confirms either that Odysseus has died at sea or that there is no more to be known about him, then I will choose a husband. The suitors agreed, but many among them were feeling that if there was any chance that Odysseus was still alive, he shouldn't be. And if Telemachus was going to get in their way, he shouldn't be alive either. So they sent a ship to a narrow passage Telemachus would have to sail through on his way back to Ithaca. The ship would wait and attack Telemachus as he passed by. Penelope sat back down at her loom. She had done all she could for her husband, and she knew she had to turn her attention to helping her son. She knew she had pushed the suitors too far. So she wove a tapestry that depicted that narrow passage of the sea. And it showed the sea on a calm, clear day with no ships in sight. She set this image before the eyes of the men who waited to attack Telemachus, so that while Telemachus sailed by, they saw nothing. When Odysseus landed on the shores of Ithaca, he overheard men on a nearby ship that was also disembarking talk to a young man named Telemachus. Now, Telemachus was the name of the infant son he had left behind 20 years ago. He looked at this man and he could see the resemblance, how Telemachus looked like both himself and his wife Penelope. Surely this was his son. Odysseus went over and introduced himself, and the father and son embraced, and then they went into the forest to scheme. Telemachus told his father about the situation with the suitors, and they agreed that Odysseus should return home in disguise. They dressed him up like a beggar. And then Telemachus led him back. When Telemachus arrived at home, the suitors were not happy to see him. They were not happy that he was alive. They were not happy that he had brought this dirty, stinking beggar with him. But some of them thought, well, maybe Telemachus had good news and it would just all be okay. And so they asked him, "What news, Telemachus? Is Odysseus dead?" "Hey, Telemachus, did you see Helen? Here she's a looker." Telemachus paused for a moment. He had not seen Helen while he was in Sparta. "No news. There is no news of Odysseus. I will go and speak with my mother, and I'm sure she will talk to you shortly. In the meantime, I have offered this beggar hospitality. You will allow him to stay with you in the great room." No, we don't want the beggar here with us." "Yes, he will stay in the great room. You will allow him to have a spot by the fire, and you will share your food with him." Odysseus sat down on the floor near the fireplace, and the suitors tossed scraps of meat to him like he was a dog. Before Telemachus walked away, Odysseus whispered to him, "Arrange for me to talk with your mother. Don't tell her who I am. You know, women can get kind of emotional about things and she might give it away, but I want to talk to her. And so Telemachus went and he conferred with Penelope. He came back, he led Odysseus, the beggar, over to speak with Penelope in one of her sitting rooms. The two sat down together. Lovely Queen Penelope, I was the king of a distant land. I have fallen on hard times. But I bring you news of Odysseus. He passed through my kingdom on his travels. And I wanted to tell you that he is alive. And he is trying to make his way back to you. Just wait for him a little bit longer. I have been waiting for Odysseus for 20 years. Yes, he's been gone for a long time, but he is on his way back. You have seen the suitors in the great hall. I cannot delay them any further. I am going to tell them that I will set a challenge. For tomorrow morning, they will compete for my hand. And perhaps Odysseus will show up to compete. My dear Queen Penelope, why should Odysseus compete for your hand? He is already your husband. He has been gone a long time. Yes, quite true. Well, Queen Penelope, say Odysseus does show up and compete. There are a lot of suitors there in the Great Hall. How could one man, even a man as great as Odysseus, defend himself against so many? A man as great and as clever as Odysseus could find a way to be the only armed man in the room. When they finished talking, Telemachus led Odysseus back to the great hall. And then Penelope appeared on her balcony. She addressed the suitors. Gentlemen, it is time. I will choose a new husband. I have decided to give you a challenge. Tomorrow morning you will compete to marry me. The challenge is this: you must string the bow of Odysseus and then shoot an arrow through 20 axe handles. Odysseus could do this, and the next man that I marry should be able to do no less. I suggest that you eat and sleep well tonight to prepare for this challenge in the morning. The suitors did eat well and drink well. They partied, celebrated that Penelope would finally choose a husband in the morning. They finally passed out all over the floor of the great hall. And when they were all asleep, Odysseus and Telemachus and a loyal servant collected all of their weapons, and Telemachus locked them away. In the morning, Penelope appeared on her balcony again to watch. Telemachus saw that 20 axes were embedded in the floor, all lined up, and he brought out Odysseus's bow. First one suitor and then another tried to string it, but none of them could quite get there. Every single suitor tried. And then they began passing the bow around again. Some of them held it near the fire to try to make the wood more pliable. Some of them began rubbing oils into it, but nothing worked. All of the suitors tried a second and a third time. They couldn't string it. And finally, Odysseus, sitting there by the fire, he called out, "Let me try." No, the beggar will not try. Penelope will not marry the beggar. And Penelope looks down at them from her balcony. No, I will not marry the beggar, but if he can do what you cannot, I will send him on his way better than he came. Fresh clothes and sandals, food to take with him on his journey. Let him try. And finally, grudgingly, the suitors handed the bow to Odysseus. In one swift motion, he strung it. Didn't even break a sweat. Then he took an arrow from Telemachus, and he shot it cleanly through those 20 axe handles that didn't even knock the inside of a single one. Perhaps it is no coincidence that at that very moment, hanging in Penelope's loom, was a tapestry, just finished, that showed Odysseus shooting that arrow through the axe handles. Now, whether he drew strength from her or she drew strength from him, who can say, because they were of one heart. After Odysseus's feat, Telemachus and the loyal servant locked all the doors to the great hall. Penelope disappeared from her balcony. And when the doors were reopened, the suitors were gone. Odysseus bathed and dressed in his own clothes before he appeared before Penelope again. Oh, it's you, Odysseus. I didn't recognize you. I'm glad you're back. You know, you have been gone for a long time, and it might take a little while for us to get back to our normal routines, and I thought perhaps we would sleep in separate rooms for a few nights. And I know how attached you are to your bed. I'll just have it moved to your room. Woman, what have you done to my bed? My bed is built into a living tree that grows through this house. I built it myself. My bed cannot be moved. Calm yourself, Odysseus. I just had to be sure it was you. You did come here in disguise. Now, of course, come with me to our room, to our bed. You can tell me about your adventures. They walked through a hallway hung with tapestries that depicted battles from the Trojan War, Odysseus's voyages as he tried to return home. And he muttered to himself, as if you didn't already know. The end. All right, so that's the first of my Trojan War heroine stories. For my next story, as I was coming up with these different stories, deciding what I wanted to work on, which stories I wanted to shape, I thought about how, you know, in the Star Wars movies, the first time that there was a female stormtrooper, people got excited about that, because sometimes representation and empowerment means that you acknowledge that there are people of your group who are not always good guys. Sometimes it's empowering to have a bad guy. And so I wanted to develop a story about a slightly more villainous character. And I settled on Helen. Why did I do it? Start the Trojan War. Ever since I was a child, men have been fighting over me, trying to steal me away. When I was 12, Theseus and Pirithous, the heroes, they kidnapped me. They carried me off and left me with Theseus's mother, Aethra. Theseus told her to raise me until I was old enough to marry, and then they left. They went to the underworld to look for a bride for Pirithous. You know, I heard that while they were there, Persephone, the goddess of spring, trapped them in the thrones. She tied them down with these crawling vines. It's very nicely done. Maybe she'll teach me that trick sometime. Now, I was with Ithra for a long time, and she taught me all about the ways of men, how they use women to get things they want: wealth, fame, alliances, children. But she said that children are good for women, too. They're just a gift from the gods. I thought that if her little heroling was any example of what I had to look forward to, I'd rather not. Theseus did eventually escape from the underworld. His cousin Hercules pulled him free as he was passing through. I heard that when Hercules forcibly yanked Theseus from the throne, it left part of his behind. There must have been some sticky sap or thorns. It was very nicely done. By the time that Theseus returned to his mother's house, I was long gone, rescued by my brothers, Castor and Pollux. I was glad to get away, but there was a part of me that hated being carried off by men again to where they thought I ought to be. And so I swore that if I ever needed rescuing again, I was going to rescue myself. I have a sister, also, Clytemnestra. Our mother, Leda, was seduced by Zeus in the form of a swan. What is particularly seductive about a swan? And how they made that work, I don't know. And I try not to think about it too hard. Leda laid 2 eggs. My brother Pollux and I hatched out of one. We are children of Zeus, demigods. Castor and Clytemnestra hatched from the other egg, and they are the children of Leda's mortal husband, Tyndareus. But of course, he raised all 4 of us like his own, which meant that he had the dubious privilege of choosing my husband when I was old enough to marry. There were many men who wanted to marry me. Rich and powerful men, men who controlled large armies. I didn't want to marry any of them, but nobody asked me. It became clear that whoever was chosen as my husband would soon find himself at war with the rest of Greece, as everyone else tried to fight him for me. And it was clever Odysseus who came up with a plan to avoid this. He suggested to Tyndareus that he have all of these men swear a pact, saying that they would fight for my future husband, should I ever be kidnapped, taken away, stolen. And that way, whoever stole me away, that man would find himself at war with all of Greece. And all the men agreed to swear this pact. They all hoped it would support their own interests. And then Odysseus suggested that so that no one would be angry with Tyndareus over his choice, they'd draw straws to decide who my husband would be. Menelaus, king of Sparta, drew the short straw. So I married Menelaus, and I moved into his home in Sparta. And I found myself once again in a place I didn't want to be, with a man I didn't want to be with. But clever Odysseus had left me an escape route. All I had to do was wait until some man who didn't know of the pact or didn't care was foolish enough to try to steal me away. And in the chaos that was sure to follow, well, I'd have the perfect diversion to make my escape. I didn't have to wait long. Paris, a prince from distant Troy, showed up. He said he was just traveling, passing through. We showed him hospitality. He stayed in our home. He dined with us. But Menelaus didn't see. When he wasn't looking, Paris would write me notes in the spilled wine. Sweet, stupid Paris. Did Aphrodite, goddess of love, give her permission for you to marry me? You didn't have my husband's permission, and you didn't have mine. I was sure if I just disappeared at the same time that Paris left, Menelaus would assume he had taken me. But it became clear that Paris wasn't going to leave without me. When I thought about it, going with him initially might aid my flight. So I met him in the courtyard one evening, and I told him I thought we should run away together. He had his ship prepared immediately. We set sail. We stood together on the deck, talking for hours. I thought he would never leave. Finally, he went to bed, I'm sure, hoping that I was going to be following him shortly. But as soon as I was alone on the deck of the ship, I transformed into a swan, a gift from my father, and I flew away. I flew to the northern shores of Africa, a place far enough away from both Greece and Troy that no one was likely to stumble across me, but close enough that I could get news of what was happening. Well, I was right. Menelaus did assume that Paris had taken me. He made his brother Agamemnon his general, and Agamemnon started pulling together his army. Now, Agamemnon, he was also married to my sister Clytemnestra. He started building his army, and he began with all the men who had sworn the pact, and some of them weren't all that interested in fighting over me anymore. Odysseus himself, who had come up with the idea, married to the lovely Penelope, an infant son, he didn't want to go to war. But Agamemnon can be very persuasive. And then he began gathering others who hadn't sworn the pact but might be willing to fight for Greece. Agamemnon had received a prophecy that Greece could not prevail without the young hero Achilles. The problem was that Achilles' mother had also gotten a prophecy that her son would either live a short but glory-filled life, or a long life that was boring. She wanted him to have the long life, so she dressed him up as a girl to try to keep him from Agamemnon. But ultimately, Achilles answered the call to battle. Young men have very foolish ideas about glory. Agamemnon assembled his army, and they were ready to set sail, but they couldn't. His ship would not go. He had offended the gods, and he learned that the only way he could sail was to sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia, which he did without a second thought, and then he set off. Agamemnon didn't think again about Iphigenia, but Clytemnestra, his wife, my sister, she did. They went to Troy, and the war was long and bloody, with many casualties on both sides. After 10 years, it was not clear that one side or the other was sure to prevail. It was finally clever Odysseus who came up with a plan to ensure Greek success. All the Greeks got in their ships and sailed away as if they were giving up and going home. But they didn't sail that far away. And they left on the shore a great wooden horse, like a sacrifice to the gods. The Trojans wheeled the wooden horse through the gates of their city, and then they celebrated the end of the war. They ate and drank heavily. They fell into deep sleep. And then hidden Greeks popped out of that wooden horse. They threw open the gates of the city and allowed the rest of the Greek army to come in. They slaughtered the sleeping Trojans. And then the war was over. And what has become of the men who fought for me? Paris died in the war. Achilles died gloriously. Odysseus survived, but he hasn't made it home yet, and maybe he never will. Agamemnon survived. When he got home, Clytemnestra greeted him like a conquering hero. She made him a large meal, and she kept his wine goblet full. She drew up a warm bath for him, and as he sat in the bath, his head lolling, she dropped a weighted net down on him that pulled him under the water and held him there a little too long. She had never forgiven him for sacrificing their daughter. How this created a real damned if you do, damned if you don't situation for their son, Orestes. According to our religion, he had to avenge his father's death, but by killing his own mother, he acquired blood guilt. Many men have died because of me, but I do make a point not to kill any of them with my own hands. It gets messy. And then there's my husband, Menelaus. He survived the war. He went home to Sparta without me. I don't know what he must have thought as he was searching the ruins of Troy. Did he wonder if Paris was telling the truth all along? That I fell off the ship that first night? I was never in Troy? Or maybe they hid me so well he just couldn't find me. Whatever he thinks. He's not searching for me. No, he has to pretend that I'm there with him in Sparta, because he can't let the rest of Greece know that they went to war for Helen and didn't bring her home. And as for me, I did it. I rescued myself. I escaped, and no one is looking for me. So I am finally free. That's the end. Thank you so much for joining me to hear these stories, and keep telling your own stories, whether they're your own twists on myths and legends that you enjoy or your own personal stories. Thanks, and have a good night.